All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into something that affects every single one of us every single day.
And yet, most people don't really understand how it works.
Exactly. Macroeconomics. It's behind like everything.
Yeah, like how much things cost.
Even like, will you get a job or not?
And like, what are the interest rates on your savings account?
So, to really understand this, we are going to look at excerpts from this really great ACCA study guide.
Kind of like a crash course on all the big ideas.
And our goal is to help you, the listener, understand these big forces that shape the world around us.
By the end, you should be able to, at least hold your own at a cocktail party when the conversation turns to economics.
You know, impress your friends.
And maybe even like make smarter decisions with your own finances.
Exactly. So let's start with like the basics.
Yeah.
What exactly is macroeconomics?
Well, it's kind of like instead of looking at like one tree, we are going to look at the whole forest.
Okay, so it's like the big picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about things like national income, unemployment, inflation.
Economic growth, things like that.
Yeah, all those things are connected, and macroeconomics tries to understand how they all interact with each other.
So it's like understanding the levers and pulleys of like the whole system, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now, imagine if you had like this really complex system,
Uh-huh.
and there's a control panel,
Okay.
and there's people trying to like keep everything running smoothly.
Okay.
That's where macroeconomic policy comes in.
So like governments are the ones trying to keep the plane flying.
Exactly. They're like using all these different tools to try to steer the economy in the right direction.
Okay, so what are they trying to achieve?
Well, some of the big goals are like, economic growth, obviously,
That makes sense.
keep inflation low,
Mm,
low unemployment so people have jobs,
right.
stability in international payments. And then, increasingly, they're focused on things like equitable distribution of income, so the benefits of growth are shared more fairly. And this one might surprise you, but environmental sustainability.
Wait, really?
Yeah. I mean, you can't have a healthy economy on a dying planet, right?
True, true.
So governments are like starting to realize that they need to balance economic growth with environmental protection.
Oh, okay. So we've talked about like what macroeconomics is and like why governments care about it.
Right.
But what actually drives this whole complex system? Like what makes it work?
Well, a big part of it is consumer spending.
Makes sense. When we buy stuff, businesses make money.
Exactly. But it's not that simple
Okay.
because our spending is really influenced by our confidence in the economy.
So if we think the economy is going to be bad,
Yeah, then we might hold back on spending.
and that makes the economy worse.
It can, yeah. It's kind
That's
of
not-
like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. Okay. So consumer confidence is important.
Uh-huh. And it's not just consumers. Businesses need to feel confident too.
Oh, right. Like they need to feel good about investing in new projects, hiring more people.
Exactly. If businesses are uncertain about the future, they might hold back on investments, and that can slow down the whole economy.
Okay, so we've got consumers, businesses, and I guess governments are a big part of this too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
They can spend money on like infrastructure projects, social programs, things like that.
Exactly. And don't forget about the global economy.
Right. We don't live in a vacuum.
Exactly. Like if a country sells more stuff to other countries than it buys from them,
So they're exporting more than they're importing.
yeah, then that can like boost their economy.
Okay,
But if they're importing way more than they're exporting,
then that's not so good.
yeah, it can create imbalances and weaken their currency.
Got it. So everything is kind of like interconnected. It's like a giant web of economic activity,
It is. And
Mhm.
all of that activity is constantly changing.
which leads us to like economic cycles.
Yeah, those booms and busts we always hear about.
Right. Like sometimes the economy is great.
Everyone's got a job. Businesses are making tons of money. Everyone's feeling optimistic.
It's like a party.
Yeah, exactly. But like all parties, they don't last forever.
And then comes the hangover.
The recession. Things slow down, people lose their jobs, and suddenly everyone's tightening their belts.
Ouch. So understanding these cycles is important.
Definitely. It helps us, prepare for those downturns and maybe make smarter choices along the way.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into two big parts of this whole thing. Inflation and unemployment.
Okay.
I think most people understand that high inflation and high unemployment are bad, but what does it actually mean for like regular people?
Well, let's take inflation, for example. Let's say you've saved up like $10,000 for a down payment on a house.
Okay.
And inflation is running at like 5% per year.
Mm-hmm.
That means that in just 1 year, your savings have lost about $500 in purchasing power.
Whoa, that's a lot.
It is. So even though you still have $10,000, It can't buy as much as it could a year ago.
So inflation is like a silent thief stealing your money.
It is.
Yeah.
It erodes the value of your savings and makes it harder to plan for the future.
Okay, that's scary. And what about unemployment?
Well, obviously it's bad when people lose their jobs, but it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
There are actually, different types of unemployment.
Really? It's not all the same.
Nope. For example, there's something called cyclical unemployment.
Okay.
It happens when the economy slows down and businesses have to lay off workers.
So it's tied to those economic cycles we were talking about.
Exactly. It's usually a temporary thing, but it can be really tough for the people who lose their jobs.
Right, of course. So that's cyclical unemployment. What are the other types?
Well, there's structural unemployment.
Okay.
This happens when, there's a mismatch between the skills workers have and the jobs that are available.
Oh, I see. Like, what if technology advances and it eliminates a bunch of jobs?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If you've spent your whole life working in a factory that gets automated, it might be hard to find a new job in, a tech field.
Right, because your skills don't match the new jobs.
Exactly. And then there's frictional unemployment.
Okay, what's that?
This is just the normal kind of unemployment that happens when people are between jobs.
Oh, okay. So, like, if you quit your job to look for a new one.
Exactly. It's normal for people to move between jobs, but if that frictional period lasts too long, it could be a sign of broader problems in the economy.
Okay, so even unemployment is more complicated than it seems at first.
Definitely. And all of these different types of unemployment have real impacts on people's lives, their families, and whole communities.
It's not just a number on a spreadsheet.
It's not. It's about real people's livelihoods.
Okay, so we've talked about inflation and unemployment.
Right.
Now let's circle back to economic growth, which, on the surface, seems like a good thing.
Yeah, generally speaking, economic growth means more jobs, higher incomes, a better standard of living.
Okay, so good things.
Yeah. But it's not always that simple.
Oh, how so?
Well, economic growth needs to be sustainable.
What does that mean?
Well, for one thing, it means that it can't come at the expense of the environment.
Right. We can't just pollute our way to prosperity.
Exactly. And it also means that the benefits of growth need to be shared fairly.
So we don't want a situation where a small group of people get super rich while everyone else is struggling.
Exactly. So economic growth is great, but only if it's done in a way that benefits everyone and doesn't harm the planet.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about what macroeconomics is, what governments are trying to achieve, the factors that drive the economy.
The impacts of inflation and unemployment.
We even touched on the idea of economic cycles.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
But so far, we've mostly been talking about, one country in isolation.
Right.
But in reality, every country is part of a global economy. So next, we need to zoom out and look at the big picture of international finance.
Exactly. How do countries interact with each other economically?
What are the challenges and opportunities of this interconnected world?
And how do those global forces affect our everyday lives?
Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's go global.
Let's do it. Okay, so we've been talking about one country, right?
Right, what's happening inside their borders.
Uh-huh. But now we need to zoom out
Okay.
and look at the global economy.
The big picture.
Yeah, because in reality, no country is an island.
Oh, I get it. It's all connected.
It is. And one of the ways that those connections are made is through international payments.
Okay, so what are international payments exactly? Is that just when I send money to my friend in another country?
Well, that's part of it, but it's way bigger than that.
Okay.
It's all the money that flows between countries
Yeah.
for everything.
Everything.
Yeah. The stuff you buy from other countries, the investments companies make in foreign markets.
Oh, right.
Even when you go on vacation to another country, that's part of international payments.
So it's this constant flow of money going back and forth all over the planet.
Yeah, exactly. And all of that activity is tracked through something called the balance of payments.
The balance of payments. That sounds kind of scary.
It's not that bad, really. It's just a country's financial statement.
Okay, so it's like a giant ledger book?
Kind of.
Yeah.
It shows how much money is coming into a country and how much is going out.
Okay, so if a country is buying more stuff from other countries than it's selling to them.
Which means they're importing more than they're exporting.
Yeah, then they have what's called a current account deficit, right?
Exactly. And that deficit has to be financed somehow, by borrowing money from other countries
No.
or selling assets.
So it's kind of like racking up debt on your credit card.
It can be, yeah. And if a country has a big current account deficit for a long time, they could be a sign of problems.
Problems like what?
Well, it could mean that the country isn't producing enough competitive goods and services.
So other countries don't want to buy their stuff,
Right. Or it could mean that the country is overly reliant on foreign borrowing.
which can't be sustainable in the long run, right?
Exactly. Okay, so that's the downside of a deficit.
Right.
But what about a surplus?
Like when a country is selling more stuff than it's buying,
Yeah, that's a current account surplus.
so that must be good, right?
Well, it's not always that simple.
Really? Why not?
Well, a big surplus can sometimes lead to, like, trade tensions with other countries
No, right.
because they might accuse the surplus country of unfair trade practices.
Okay, so even a surplus can be a problem.
It can be, yeah. Sometimes a surplus might mean that a country isn't investing enough domestically.
So they're making all this money from exports, but they're not using it to improve things at home.
Yeah, that's one possibility. It's all about finding the right balance.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've talked about the balance of payments,
Right.
but there's another big piece of the puzzle, isn't there? Exchange rates.
Oh, yeah. Exchange rates.
Those things always confuse me.
Well, think of it this way. Each country has its own currency.
Right, like dollars, euros, yen.
Exactly. And those currencies are constantly being traded against each other.
So like how many dollars you can get for 1 euro.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the exchange rate.
Okay, so why do these exchange rates matter?
Well, they can have a huge impact on like how much things cost.
Really? How so?
Okay, let's say the US dollar weakens against the euro.
Okay.
That means that it takes more dollars to buy 1 euro.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in the US and you want to buy something from Europe, it's going to cost you more.
Because you need more dollars to get the same amount of euros.
Exactly.
So a weaker currency makes imported goods more expensive.
Exactly. And on the flip side, it makes exports cheaper.
So if the dollar is weak, American products become more attractive to buyers in Europe.
Exactly. Because they can get more for their euro.
Okay, so there are winners and losers depending on which way the exchange rate goes.
Yeah, it's a constant balancing act. And businesses have to factor those exchange rate fluctuations into their plans.
So how are these exchange rates actually determined? Is there like some global committee that sets the prices?
Haha. No, it's not quite like that.
Okay, so how does it work?
Exchange rates are determined by supply and demand in the foreign exchange market.
Okay, so it's like a giant auction house for currencies.
Exactly. People are constantly buying and selling currencies, and the prices go up and down based on how much people want to buy or sell a particular currency.
Okay, so if lots of people want to buy dollars, the price of the dollar goes up.
Right. And if lots of people want to sell dollars, the price goes down.
Got it. So it's all about supply and demand.
Exactly. And all sorts of things can influence those supply and demand forces.
Like what?
Well, economic conditions in different countries.
Okay, so if a country's economy is doing well, people might want to buy their currency because they think it's a good investment.
Right.
What else?
Political events can also have an impact.
Oh, right. Like if there's a lot of uncertainty in a country.
People might want to sell their currency and buy something that seems safer.
Okay, so exchange rates are affected by all sorts of things.
They are. It's a really complex system. And governments and central banks are constantly trying to manage these exchange rates.
Oh, right. They want to keep their currency stable.
Exactly. But it's not easy because there are so many factors at play.
Okay, so we've talked about global trade, the balance of payments, exchange rates.
Right.
Now, how do governments actually manage all of this? What tools do they have?
Well, it's those same tools we talked about earlier.
Like fiscal and monetary policy.
Exactly. Governments use those tools to try and influence the economy, both domestically and internationally.
So it's like a multi-level game of chess.
Kind of. They're trying to anticipate what other countries are going to do and make the best moves for their own economy.
Okay, so let's talk about fiscal policy first.
Right.
Remind me, what is fiscal policy again?
It's basically the government's spending and tax policies.
Oh, right. So like if the government decides to build a new highway.
That would be an example of fiscal policy.
Okay, and how does that affect the global economy?
Well, it depends on a lot of things, but it could lead to like increased demand for imported materials.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
If they need to buy steel or concrete from other countries.
Exactly. And it could also create jobs, which could attract workers from other countries.
So one country's fiscal policy can have ripple effects all over the world.
Definitely. And it's not just spending either. Tax policy can also have an impact.
Okay, so like if a country lowers its corporate tax rates,
That could attract foreign companies to invest there.
which could mean jobs and economic growth for that country.
Exactly. But it could also mean that other countries lose out on those investments.
Right, because the companies might decide to move their operations to the country with the lower taxes.
Exactly. So it's all interconnected.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's fiscal policy. Now, what about monetary policy?
Okay, so remember, monetary policy is controlled by central banks.
Like the Federal Reserve in the US.
Uh-huh. And the main tool they use is interest rates.
Right, they can raise or lower interest rates.
Exactly. And by doing that, they can try to influence things like inflation and economic growth.
Okay, so how does that affect the global economy?
Well, let's say the Fed raises interest rates in the U.S. That could make U.S. assets more attractive to foreign investors.
Because they can earn a higher return on their investment.
Exactly. So foreign investors might start buying more U.S. dollars.
To invest in US assets?
And that could lead to the U.S. dollar getting stronger.
Oh, okay. And that would have all those effects on imports and exports that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. So you can see how the actions of one central bank can have repercussions all over the world.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It is. And then there's supply-side policies, which are a bit different.
Okay, what are those?
These policies aim to, increase the productive capacity of an economy.
So instead of just trying to stimulate demand, they're trying to make the economy more efficient.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do they do that?
Well, there are lots of ways.
Like what?
One example would be, investing in education and training programs.
Okay, so that would create a more skilled workforce.
Exactly. Which could lead to higher productivity and economic growth.
Makes sense. What else?
Another example would be, improving infrastructure.
Like roads, bridges, airports, things like that.
Yeah. That makes it easier for businesses to operate and transport goods.
Right, which can boost the economy.
Exactly. And then there are things like reducing regulations.
Okay, so making it easier for businesses to start and operate.
Yeah. The idea is that by making the economy more efficient, you can boost growth in a sustainable way.
Okay, so those are supply-side policies. And those can have international impacts too, right?
Definitely. If one country makes a big investment in research and development, that could lead to new technologies that benefit the whole world.
Oh, right. Like if they invent a new cure for a disease.
Exactly. Or a new source of clean energy.
Okay, so those are the positive spillovers, but there can be negative ones too, right?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Like what?
Well, one example would be if a country relaxes its environmental regulations.
To try and attract more businesses.
Exactly. But that could lead to more pollution, which could affect neighboring countries.
Right, because pollution doesn't respect borders.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
So you can see how, one country's policies can have unintended consequences for other countries.
Yeah, it's a complicated world out there.
It is. But that's why it's so important to understand how these things work.
So we can make better decisions.
Exactly. We need to be aware of the interconnectedness of the global economy.
And how our actions can affect people all over the world.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have. We've gone from the domestic economy to the global economy.
We've talked about trade, exchange rates, fiscal and monetary policy.
And supply-side policies.
Whoa.
It's a lot to take in, but I feel like I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Me too.
But there's one thing I'm still wondering about.
What's that?
We've talked about all these big abstract concepts,
Yeah.
but how does all of this actually affect people in their everyday lives?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's the most important one, really.
It is. What does all this mean for me, for my family, for my community?
Right. Because at the end of the day, macroeconomics is about people.
And not just about numbers and theories.
It's about how those numbers and theories affect real people's lives.
Exactly. So let's bring it all back down to earth now.
Okay.
Let's talk about the real-world impacts of all these macroeconomic forces.
Let's do it.
So we've talked about all this high-level stuff,
Mm.
The global economy, exchange rates, interest rates, all these big forces.
Yeah.
But how does this actually play out in real life?
Yeah, good question. How does this affect, people's daily lives?
Right. Give me some examples.
Okay, well, think about, going to the grocery store, right?
Right.
And you see, the price of cheese has gone up.
Uh-huh.
That could be because of exchange rates, right?
Oh, right. If our currency weakens against, say, the euro.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then, imported cheese from, France or Italy.
It can be more expensive.
Yeah, exactly. Because, it takes more of our currency to buy the same amount of euros.
Yeah. So those exchange rates we talked about, they actually show up in the price of my cheese.
They do. And it's not just cheese. It's, anything that's imported.
Cars, electronics, clothes, all that stuff.
Yeah, if our currency weakens, all that stuff gets more expensive.
So, all that stuff we hear on the news about, trade wars and currency fluctuations,
Oh, yeah.
it's not just, abstract stuff.
It's not. It affects how much we pay for things every day.
Exactly. Okay, so that's exchange rates. What about those interest rates we talked about?
Oh, yeah. Interest rates are huge.
So, like, if the Fed raises interest rates,
It becomes more expensive to borrow money.
right, like if I want to buy a house,
You're going to have to pay a higher mortgage rate.
which means I can't afford to buy as much house.
Exactly. Or maybe you can't get a mortgage at all.
Ouch.
And it's not just mortgages. Like, credit card interest rates go up too.
So basically, it just gets more expensive to live your life.
It can, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if your wages aren't keeping up with inflation.
Right, right. Okay, so that's how interest rates affect individuals. What about businesses?
Businesses are definitely affected too.
Yeah, we talked about how, like, exporters and importers are affected by exchange rates.
Uh-huh.
But what about, like, other kinds of businesses?
Well, like, think about a small business owner who needs a loan to expand their operations.
Okay.
If interest rates are high, that loan is going to be more expensive.
Which could make the difference between expanding or not.
Exactly. Or, like, maybe they have to lay off workers to make ends meet.
Because they can't afford to pay them anymore.
Right. And then there's fiscal policy.
Oh, right, like government spending and
Ah.
taxes.
Uh-huh. So, like, if the government cuts spending on infrastructure projects,
Like roads and bridges.
yeah, that could mean less work for construction companies.
Which means fewer jobs for construction workers.
Exactly. And that can ripple out to other parts of the economy, too.
Because those construction workers aren't spending money at local businesses anymore.
Exactly. So you see how, like, one policy decision can have a dominant effect.
Yeah, it's like everything is connected.
It is. And that's what macroeconomics is all about. Understanding those connections and how those big forces affect our lives.
So it's not just about, like, abstract theories and models.
It's not. It's about real people.
Their jobs, their homes, their families.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for everyone to understand at least the basics of macroeconomics.
Because it affects us all.
It does, no matter where you live, no matter what you do.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to think about.
It is. But hopefully now you have a better understanding of how this whole system works.
I definitely do. This has been such an enlightening deep dive.
It's been fun.
It has. So to wrap things up, like, what's the one big takeaway you want listeners to remember from all of this?
That's a good question. I guess I would say, like, don't be afraid of macroeconomics.
Yeah, it can seem intimidating.
It can,
Yeah.
but it's really not that complicated once you break it down.
Right, and it's so important.
It is. It affects all of us, so we should all try to understand it.
Exactly. So keep learning, stay curious.
Ask questions.
And don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Yeah. The world of macroeconomics is constantly changing.
So we need to stay informed and engaged.
Absolutely.
Well, that's our deep dive into macroeconomics. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep seeking knowledge.